The runway was a blinding stretch of heat. A $40 million jet sat vibrating, ready for takeoff. Elite engineers stood in a circle, masked by arrogant confidence. An older single dad, wearing a faded vest, pushed a tool cart past them. Someone snorted, whispering, "Janitor, stay back." The CEO crossed her arms, eyes fixed on the cockpit. Suddenly the engines roared, then faltered, with a microscopic shudder. A faint scent of burning ozone drifted through the air. The single dad stopped. He turned and said one sharp sentence. "Stop the engine." Mocking laughter erupted. 30 seconds later, a terrifying silence swallowed everything. Ethan Cole was 41 years old, but his eyes carried the weight of 100 lifetimes. He lived in a quiet corner of the world, a man whose existence began and ended with his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. Every morning before the sun even touched the horizon, Ethan was awake. He brushed Lily's hair with a tenderness that contradicted his rugged, grease-stained appearance. He packed her lunch, tucked a small note inside her bag, usually a drawing of a small airplane or a star, and walked her to the school bus with a steady, comforting smile. Since his wife Elena passed away from cancer 4 years ago, Ethan had become a master of invisibility. Elena had been the vibrant soul of their home, a woman who believed Ethan's hands were capable of fixing anything in the universe. Now those hands mostly held a mop or a trash bag. He worked as an outsourced maintenance technician at the regional airport, a job most people considered beneath their notice. To the pilots and the wealthy travelers, he was just part of the background, a ghost in a reflective vest who emptied the bins and mopped the spills. They didn't see the calloused precision of his fingers or the way he studied the blueprints of every aircraft that landed, memorizing their flaws in the dark of his small apartment. For Ethan, the grease was a shield. If he looked like a failure, no one would ask him about his past. No one would ask why the greatest mind in propulsion design was now scrubbing floors. But Ethan Cole wasn't always a janitor. A decade ago, he was a senior aeronautical engineer, a man whose name was whispered with absolute respect in the hallowed halls of jet engine design. He had been the lead architect of some of the most advanced propulsion systems in the sky. However, his career came to a crashing, unfair halt after a technical accident that wasn't his fault. A design flaw he had warned about was ignored by his superiors, who were chasing a government contract deadline. When an engine failed on a test flight, the board of directors made him the convenient scapegoat. They stripped him of his credentials and his pride. He didn't sue. He didn't scream for justice. Elena had been sick then, and every ounce of his energy went into her care. He simply took the blame, accepted his termination, and disappeared into the shadows to raise Lily in peace. He traded the high-stakes boardroom for a quiet life, preferring the honest grime of a tool cart over the polished laws of an office. On this particular Tuesday, the heat was radiating off the asphalt in shimmering, distorted waves. Ethan was assigned to clean the auxiliary hangar area near the private terminal. He moved with a rhythmic, practiced efficiency, his eyes always scanning the machines around him. It was a habit he couldn't break. He could hear the health of an engine just by the frequency of its hum. That's when he saw the V-12 executive jet. It was a masterpiece of modern engineering, a sleek silver bird preparing for a high-profile flight. He saw the team of young, polished engineers checking their tablets, their movements quick and performative. They looked like they were in a commercial for success, while Ethan looked like a man who had forgotten what success felt like. Ethan stopped his cart. The air was thick with the smell of kerosene and hot rubber. He stood still, tilting his head slightly to the left, listening. Most people heard the massive roar of the twin turbines, but Ethan heard the stutter. It was a tiny rhythmic hiccup in the intake cycle, a sound so subtle that it wouldn't even trigger a standard sensor alert yet. To Ethan, it was a scream of agony from the metal itself. He remembered Elena's heart monitor in those final days, the way a slight change in the beep meant everything was about to change. He recognized the symptoms of a pre-combustion chamber failure, the kind of catastrophic malfunction that turns a jet into a flying bomb the moment it reaches full thrust. He knew the chemistry of the fuel and the physics of the alloy. He knew that in exactly 90 seconds, the pressure would exceed the structural integrity of the wing. He knew he shouldn't speak. He knew his place in the hierarchy of this airport. He looked at his hands, stained with the morning's work, and then at the plane. But he looked at the cockpit and saw the silhouette of the pilots, men with families waiting for them at home. He saw the CEO, a woman named Sarah Vance, who was known for her ruthless efficiency. Ethan took a deep breath, the smell of jet fuel thick in his lungs. He abandoned his cart and stepped onto the restricted area of the runway. The security guards immediately tensed, and the lead engineer, a man in his late 20s with a perfectly pressed lab coat named Tyler, stepped forward with a look of pure disdain. "Hey, get back to the hangar, old man," Tyler barked, gesturing toward the cleaning supplies. "This is a sterile zone. You're interfering with a multi-million-dollar departure." Sarah Vance turned her head, her eyes narrowing as she took in Ethan's disheveled appearance. "Who is this?" she asked, her voice like cracking ice. "Just a maintenance guy, Ms. Vance. Probably got lost looking for the restroom," Tyler replied, prompting a wave of chuckles from the surrounding staff. Ethan didn't flinch. He looked directly at Sarah, ignoring the mockery. "You are not cleared to speak," she said coldly. But Ethan didn't move. He stood his ground in the middle of the blinding heat, a man who had lost everything once and was prepared to lose his dignity again if it meant saving a life. The lead engineer, Tyler, held up his tablet with a triumphant flourish, showing the data to Sarah. "All systems are green, Ms. Vance. Fuel pressure is nominal. Vibrations are within the 5% tolerances, and the thermal sensors are cold. We are perfectly ready for takeoff. This man is just a distraction." Sarah nodded, checking her gold watch. "We're already 10 minutes behind schedule. Get the pilots moving. I have a merger in Singapore that won't wait for a janitor's imagination." Ethan took another step forwards, his voice low and steady. He wasn't shouting. He was speaking with the quiet authority of a man who had designed the very components they were testing. "The sensors aren't reading the right zone, Tyler," Ethan said, using the engineer's name from his badge. "You're looking at the exhaust manifold, but the problem is in the secondary compression ring. There's a thermal stress fracture the size of a human hair, and it's sitting right in the path of the ignition spark. Your software is designed to smooth out noise, but that noise is the metal failing." Tyler laughed, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed off the hangar walls. "A thermal stress fracture? On a brand new turbine? Do you even know how these engines are cast? They are single crystal alloys, janitor. They don't just crack because an old man has a bad feeling. Go back to your mop before I have you arrested for trespassing." Ethan remembered the accident 10 years ago. He remembered sitting in a boardroom very similar to this runway, explaining a similar flaw to men who looked exactly like Tyler. He had been ignored then, and innocent people had paid the price. The weight of that memory pressed down on him, heavier than the midday sun. He looked at the engine again. The vibration was increasing, the frequency shifting from a hum to a subtle metallic rattle. To anyone else, it was just the sound of power. To Ethan, it was the sound of a funeral. "It's not just vibration," Ethan said, his eyes never leaving the engine cowling. "It's a resonant frequency mismatch. If you start that engine and bring it to 70% throttle, the oscillation will shatter the fuel line. It will explode within 90 seconds of leaving the ground. You won't even have time to declare an emergency. You'll be a fireball over the suburbs." The air on the runway seemed to thin. The mocking laughter died down, replaced by an uncomfortable tension. Tyler looked at Sarah, his face reddening. "This is ridiculous. He's a janitor. Security, get him off the field now before he causes a real delay." Two guards moved in, grabbing Ethan by the arms. He didn't struggle, he didn't fight. He just looked straight into Sarah Vance's eyes. It was a freeze-frame moment. Sarah saw something in Ethan's gaze. A lack of fear, a total lack of ego. In her world of high finance, everyone wanted something. They wanted money, power, or validation. This man was simply telling her a fact, like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis without emotion. She felt a shiver of doubt crawl up her spine despite the 100-degree heat. She thought about the last time she had felt this way, right before a major market crash that she had predicted while others ignored the signs. "Your choice," Ethan said as the guards began to drag him back toward the grass. "Or your funeral. Your daughter will be an orphan, because you were too proud to listen to a man in a vest. That was the killing blow. Sarah's grip on her briefcase tightened until her knuckles turned white. She had a daughter too. Sarah looked at the jet, then back at the man in the dirty vest. She was a woman who lived by data, by hard numbers and expert opinions. But she was also a woman who had survived in a male-dominated industry by trusting her gut. And her gut was screaming that the janitor wasn't lying. The engineers were confident, but the janitor was certain. There is a profound difference between the two. "Wait," Sarah commanded. The guard stopped instantly. Tyler turned to her, his jaw dropping in disbelief. "Miss Vance, you can't be serious. We have a meeting in Singapore. If we miss this slot, we lose the merger. We lose the lead. We lose everything." Sarah looked at the cockpit, then at Tyler. "Shut it down," she said, her voice quiet but absolute. "Tell the pilots to cut the turbines now. We are doing a manual inspection. If this man is wrong, I'll personally ensure he never works in an airport again. But if he's right, oh no, God help us all." The engines began to whine as they decelerated, the massive fans slowing their rotation. The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the distant sound of other planes taking off. For 30 seconds, nothing happened. The sun continued to beat down, and the smell of hot asphalt was overwhelming. Tyler smirked, crossing his arms and shaking his head. "See, nothing. A complete waste of time. I hope you're ready to pay for the fuel we just burned, old man. Your career as a janitor is officially over. In fact, you'll be lucky if you aren't in a cell by sunset." Tyler stepped toward Ethan, his face inches from the older man's. "I've spent 7 years at MIT and another 5 at the manufacturer's design lab. I know every bolt on this V12. You know how to change a light bulb and empty a bin. Your interference today is more than just an annoyance. It's professional sabotage." He gestured to the silent engine. "The titanium housing is cool to the touch. The diagnostics are clean. You've let your imagination get the best of you, old man, and it's going to cost you the only job you have left." But Ethan didn't respond to the insults. He wasn't even looking at Tyler. He was staring at the ventilation slits on the secondary bypass duct. His ears weren't listening to the wind anymore. They were tuned to the sound of metal contracting. "The bypass isn't shedding the residual thermal load," Ethan whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "It's pooling." Suddenly, a low, guttural metallic groan echoed from deep within the turbine. It sounded like a giant being strangled. It was a grinding, agonizing sound, the sound of 2 surfaces that should never touch beginning to weld themselves together in the dark. The temperature readings on Tyler's tablet began to strobe in bright, violent red. The numbers climbed at an impossible rate, jumping by hundreds of degrees every second. 800 degrees, 1,500 degrees, 2,500 degrees. "What the hell?" Tyler whispered, his hands beginning to shake so hard he almost dropped the device. "The engine is off. The fuel pumps are closed. There's no ignition source." "Heat soak," Ethan said, walking back toward the jet as the guards released him. He pushed past Tyler, who was now frozen in shock. "The fracture let a small amount of fuel leak into the stagnant air of the housing before you shut it down. Without the cooling airflow of the running engine, that trapped fuel is cooking the insulation. It's a pressure cooker now. You were looking at the sensors, but I was looking at the physics. If the engine were still running at full thrust, that fuel would have hit the main ignition and boom." A sharp metallic pop echoed across the runway, a sound like a gunshot in the still afternoon air. It was followed by a plume of thick black smoke erupting from the engine intake, curling up toward the clear sky. A small, violent tongue of orange flame licked at the silver casing, bubbling the expensive paint before the automatic fire suppression system triggered. A high-pressure blast of white chemical foam doused the interior, coating the internal blades in a ghostly, freezing layer of protection. The entire team stood frozen, paralyzed by the sight of the $40 million bird gasping for its life. Tyler dropped his tablet onto the asphalt, the screen shattering into a spiderweb of glass, a perfect metaphor for his career. He realized in that moment that he had almost murdered the most powerful woman in the country and 2 pilots. If that engine had reached takeoff thrust, the pop would have been a catastrophic blast that would have ripped the wing off the plane and incinerated the cabin in seconds. Sarah Vance walked toward the engine, her face pale. She looked at the white foam dripping from the multi-million-dollar machine. Then she turned to look at Ethan. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was just leaning against his tool cart, breathing slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets to hide the slight tremor of his fingers. He had seen this ghost before, and he was just glad it hadn't taken anyone this time. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling for the first time in her life. She realized she didn't even know the name of the man who had just saved her life. Before Ethan could answer, the airport's chief of maintenance, an older man named Bill, came running onto the field, breathless and terrified. He looked at the smoke, then at Ethan, and then at the name on the flight manifest. His eyes went wide with a shock that was greater than the fire itself. "Ethan," Bill gasped. "Miss Vance, I didn't know he was out here. This is Ethan Cole." Sarah frowned, still trying to process the near-death experience. "I know he's Ethan Cole. He's a maintenance tech." "No," Bill said, his voice dropping in awe. "He's the Ethan Cole, the lead designer of the Mk9 turbine series, the man who wrote the safety protocols for every jet in this fleet 10 years ago. He was the golden boy of aviation before the board threw him under the bus." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the name now. She had read about the Cole scandal in business school, the genius engineer who had been blamed for a freak accident and then vanished into thin air. She looked at the man in the grease-stained vest and realized she was standing in the presence of a fallen king who had just saved her from a burning throne. "Why didn't you say who you were?" Sarah asked, stepping closer to him, ignoring the smell of fire and chemicals. "If you had told us your credentials, we would have listened instantly. You wouldn't have had to stand there and be mocked." Ethan looked at her, a tired, honest smile touching his lips. "It wouldn't have mattered, Sarah. If you need a title to hear the truth, then you aren't really listening. The engine doesn't care about my resume. It only cares about the physics. And physics doesn't lie, even when people do. Besides, I've spent 10 years being invisible. It's a lot quieter that way." In the weeks that followed, the airport was a hive of activity. The incident had triggered a massive internal investigation that reached the highest levels of the aviation authority. Sarah Vance didn't just fire Tyler and his team. She ordered a full audit of every V-12 jet in the country. What they found confirmed Ethan's warning. A batch of faulty compression rings had been installed across several aircraft, a hidden defect that would have eventually led to dozens of deaths. It was a corporate cover-up by the parts manufacturer that Ethan had sniffed out with just his ears. Sarah called Ethan into her private office. She offered him everything: a senior vice presidency, a salary 10 times what he was making, a public apology from the aviation board, and a corner office with a view of the city he had helped protect. "We can restore your name, Ethan," she said, pushing a contract across the mahogany desk. "You can have your life back. You can be the man you were supposed to be before they ruined you. Think about your daughter. Think about the life you could give her." Ethan sat in the expensive leather chair, feeling out of place. He thought about Lily. He thought about their quiet evenings together, the way she looked at him not as a senior engineer, but just as her dad. He thought about the young engineers like Tyler, who had been taught to trust screens over their own senses, and how they needed a different kind of teacher. "I don't want the title," Ethan said, pushing the contract back with a firm hand. "And I don't want my name on a plaque. I've been a somebody before, Sarah. It almost cost me my soul. I'm much happier being the man my daughter thinks I am." Sarah was stunned. "Why? You were wronged. This is your chance for justice. You can be famous again." Ethan replied, "I want one thing. I want you to publish the full technical report on the defect. No corporate glossing, no hidden clauses. Tell the industry exactly where the flaw was and how it was missed. And I want you to change the safety protocols. Every technician, no matter their rank, should have the power to stop a takeoff if they hear something wrong. No questions asked. Give the power back to the people who actually touch the machines, the ones whose hands are dirty." Sarah looked at him, realizing the financial implications. Publicly admitting to a massive technical flaw would tank the company's stock in the short term. It would lead to lawsuits and regulatory headaches. But she looked at the man across from her and saw a level of integrity she had never encountered in the boardroom. "You're asking me to hurt my own company to protect the industry," she said. "I'm asking you to protect people," Ethan countered. "If you do this, I'll help you redesign the assembly line for free. But I won't do it for a salary. I'll do it as a consultant, on my own time, so I can still be home to cook dinner for my daughter. I'm a dad first, Sarah, a janitor second, and an engineer only when I have to be." Sarah agreed. The following month was a bloodbath in the news. The stock plummeted, and the great jet defect became the lead story on every channel. But hidden within the case, hundreds of planes were grounded and repaired. Thousands of lives were saved because one woman chose to listen to a man in a faded vest. Ethan went back to his old job at the hangar, but with a new arrangement. He was now the chief quality auditor, though he refused to wear a suit. He still wore his reflective vest and pushed his tool cart. Now, when he walked past the groups of engineers, they didn't laugh. They stopped, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and unearned respect. They watched how he touched the metal, how he closed his eyes to listen to the vibrations. He had become a living legend in the hangar, the man who knew the language of the machines. The school bell rang, and a flood of children erupted from the doors of the elementary school. Ethan stood by the gate, leaning against his old truck. The engine was purring perfectly. He had spent the weekend tuning it until it sounded like a heartbeat. He had spent the morning working on a complex hydraulic leak on a jumbo jet, and his hands were stained with dark oil, but he didn't care. Lily ran toward him, her backpack bouncing with every step. She jumped into his arms, and he swung her around, her laughter the only sound that truly mattered to him in the entire universe. "Daddy, why are people nicer today?" she asked as they walked toward the truck. "Even the principal waved at me, and Mr. Henderson brought us cookies." Ethan smiled, helping her into the passenger seat. "Because they finally learned how to listen, Lily. Sometimes people have to get a little scared before they start hearing the truth. But don't worry, the truth is always there, even when it's quiet. And it's much more important to be right than to be loud." The story of the anonymous technician became a legend in the aviation world. There were no photos of him in the papers. There were no televised interviews. He remained a shadow, a ghost story told by pilots to remind themselves to stay humble. He had found his justice not in a courtroom, but in the safe landings of 1,000 planes. He had honored Elena's memory by being exactly the man she knew he was. One evening, a small, hand-delivered envelope arrived at Ethan's house. Inside was a simple card from Sarah Vance. There were no legal documents or offers of money, just a few words written in her sharp, elegant hand. "You saved more than a plane that day, Ethan. You saved my soul from the weight of 1,000 mistakes. You taught me that the most important parts of a machine are the ones that don't make any noise. Thank you for standing your ground when the rest of us were too blind to see the fire. You are the richest man I have ever known." Ethan read the note, then folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer next to Lily's old drawings and Elena's wedding ring. He didn't need a public apology to feel whole. He had his daughter, he had his peace, and he had the knowledge that somewhere in the sky, a jet was flying safely because he had dared to speak up when everyone else was laughing. As the last jet of the night disappeared into the velvet clouds, leaving a white streak against the stars, Ethan felt a sense of completion. He wasn't a scapegoat anymore. He wasn't just a janitor. He was a protector. There are people who don't need to be believed. They only need to be listened to. We spend our lives looking up at the high flyers, forgetting that the most important truths often come from the people we choose not to see. The runway was quiet now. The explosion that didn't happen was a silent victory, a testament to the power of a single man's character. As the stars came out over the hangar, the lesson remained. True authority isn't given by a badge or a title. It's earned by the truth, and it's held by the ones who are brave enough to tell it, even when they are standing alone in the heat. Ethan Cole, the man the world tried to erase, had become the silent guardian of the sky, one hum at a time. If this story reminded you that everyone has a voice worth hearing, please leave a comment and subscribe to Daddy Healing Stories. We tell the stories of the quiet heroes, the single parents, and the invisible giants who change the world one small act at a time. Thank you for listening.